Okay, so you've had a chance to create your value scale. That's usually what I would start with first because it's at the top of the page before you jump into some of the other techniques. Now I'm going to be teaching you how to do some of the other techniques with your watercolors that can be pretty fun and have some very interesting results. So the first one we're going to start with is wet on dry. And basically what you're doing is you're applying wet paint to dry paper, and you can add designs on top of the dry paint. So I can take my brush, stir up the blue, and I'm going to take, like I said, I'm just going to paint wet paint on top of dry paper. So this one is very straightforward. Now the next one that we're going to do is called wet on wet, which means you are going to be applying wet paint to wet paper. So you can see it gives it a softer look to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of my brushes and I'm just going to apply a layer of water onto the paper. And again, like I said in the last practice, paint wants to stay where the water is at. So if I keep my water within the box, the paint's going to want to stay within the box. And then I'm going to take and mix a little bit of water, some of my paint. So maybe for this one, I'm going to go with a little orange. So I take some paint, mix it in with a little water. Okay, now I'm going to paint over the top of my water, and you can see that it has a much softer look. You can see the paint is seeking out where the water is at. Oh, and this brush is shedding a little bit. You'll have that sometimes. So it gives you a nice soft edge, and you can see that the paint is just kind of dispersing into the area where the water is at. So kind of hard to see with the glare. There you go. The next one I'm going to have you do is called a dry brush. So you're going to take your brush, I like to use a small brush for this one, and you're going to dry it out really well so there's not a lot of extra paint. And essentially what you're going to be doing is you're going to be drawing with paint onto dry paper. So use a small brush to paint a design on dry paper. And a lot of times for this, I will take and just dip right in the paint, and I'm going to draw whatever I would like for this. So maybe I'll draw out my initial. So this is a chance to kind of practice using some control with the dry brush. Resist. There are many forms of resist. One way you could choose to do a resist is called the wax resist. You take a white crayon and you draw out something, and then you apply paint that's been mixed with water over the top of it, and wherever you drew with the wax crayon, you won't be your paint won't be able to get to the paper, and so it will resist, the wax resist absorbing the paint there. So that's one technique. Another resist technique, you can do a tape resist, so where you take masking tape and lay it down onto the paper and you paint over the top of it. When the paint is dry, then you'll peel the masking tape up, and that will leave a resist area where your paint could not get to your paper. So I'm going to do a little bit of both here. Okay, the next one we're going to look at is called lifting. There are a couple different methods that you can use for lifting. For the lifting technique, you can choose paper towel. So here's what it looks like when you have paper towel. What you're going to do is you're going to apply paint first, and then you're going to press down whatever material you're using for the lifting. So here I use paper towel, here I use saran wrap. If it's paper towel, you can press down and then lift up right away, and you get this technique. If you want it to be with saran wrap, I would suggest leaving the saran wrap on the paint until the paint dries and then peeling it up, and it can really give you an interesting texture to it. Now you'll see there are a couple of other sections. For the others, you get to choose what you want to do. I will show you several techniques in these boxes. You can do more than one technique, but make sure to write down what the techniques are that you did in these boxes. So another technique that you could choose to go with is called gather. And with gather, you're going to mix some paint with water, and then you're going to paint your paper, and then you're going to sprinkle salt on top of the wet paint. And what happens is the salt gathers the paint with the water to it, and it can create these darker speckles and textures on the paper. There's something called disperse, where you take and you apply paint to your paper, and then you just drip some rubbing alcohol on top of it, and the rubbing alcohol dispels or disperses the color from the areas where it drips. You could do a stamping technique where you use a sponge to stamp paint, or you can put some paint on bubble wrap and then stamp it on the paper and get some unique textures. You can do the speckle technique where you use a toothbrush to speckle the paint, or you can drag the toothbrush against the surface of the paper, and that will give you kind of a striped dry brush technique, but that's called speckle. And then the last one that we haven't talked about is sgraffito, and it's a little hard to see here on the example, but what you do is you take a paper clip, the end of a paper clip, and you scratch the surface of your paper, and then you paint over the top of it, and the paint absorbs into the scratches and it gets darker in the areas that you have scratched. Okay, so a lot of these materials will be in the plastic bag at your table. Some of them you might have to check out from the teacher in order to do them. The first technique that I'm going to show you is the stamping technique. So I have some bubble wrap here, and I'm going to take my paintbrush, and I'm going to take and get some paint, and I'm just going to paint right on to the bubble wrap with the paint. And then I'm going to take and just stamp or place the bubble wrap down on my box and press down. And then I'm going to lift up, and we can see the stamping technique there. And then I can take my sponge and I can dip it into one of the paint colors. And I would recommend putting the paint in your tray. So I'm just using some of the purple from my tray that I already had. And I'm just going to stamp it right there. So I'm getting that sponge texture. The next one I'm going to show you is gather. Gather works a little bit better if you have some water mixed with the paint. And I'm going to go ahead and paint this right in that section there. And then you'll probably need to check out a salt shaker from the teacher, and you're just going to shake a little bit of salt onto that area. And when it's dry, then you can brush the salt off of your paper, and it'll just leave that speckling that we saw earlier. Okay, we're going to do some sgraffito. So I'm going to take a paper clip, and here in this box, I'm going to go ahead and just draw right along the edge. And I'm just gonna, oops, I have a little too much paint there. You want to make sure there's some water mixed in with it, that it's not too thick. This is pretty thick, so what I can also do is take and do a little lifting. And so now you can really see that sgraffito where I scratched in. The disperse, so I'm going to take a little bit of paint this bottom section here. Now this one you'll definitely have to check out from the teacher. This is the rubbing alcohol, and you're not going to spray it. You're actually going to just use the end to drip right onto the paper, and wherever it reaches the paint, it will force the paint to leave that area. The last one we haven't done is speckle. So one way, like I said, you can take your toothbrush and you can either dip it in your tray or you can dip it right in the paint here, and you can take, and I like to hold it going the opposite direction, and then you're just going to pull back on the bristles, and that forces the paint downward. If you mix the paint, so that was just with direct paint, but if you take and add some water to your paint palette and add your paint to that, you might get a little bit better speckling. And then again, I can dip it in my paint, and I can also drag it to create kind of that dry brush technique there. So those are all of the techniques that I'm going to show you for this project. Make sure you take and write down what techniques you use. So once you have done this, then you're going to go ahead and set it up on the drying rack to dry. And once it's all dry, you will turn in your assignment.